"You can fix the engine," the elegant woman said as she folded her sunglasses and looked around the tiny garage with a smile that felt more like a challenge than kindness. "But you'll never fix the distance between people like you and people like me." The old shop fell silent. Even the soft ticking of cooling engines seemed to disappear beneath the weight of her words. Ethan Brooks simply wiped his hands on a faded blue shop towel, glanced at the weathered 1967 Shelby Mustang resting beneath the afternoon sun, and offered the same calm expression that had carried him through every difficult season of his life. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He only asked, "What seems to be the problem with the car?" Claire Kensington crossed her arms. Her tailored navy suit looked completely out of place beside rusted tool cabinets and cracked concrete stained by decades of honest work. She was the CEO of Kensington Automotive Group, one of the fastest-growing luxury performance companies in America, and everyone in the county recognized her face from business magazines and television interviews. She pointed toward the Mustang without taking her eyes off Ethan. "If you can make it run perfectly before sunset, I'll make you rich." A few customers waiting for oil changes exchanged amused glances. One young mechanic quietly whispered, "She's got to be kidding." Another shook his head. "That car's been through 3 restoration shops. Nobody could figure it out." Ethan walked slowly toward the Shelby. He didn't rush because rushing had never solved anything worth solving. His fingers brushed lightly across the faded hood, lingering for just a second as though he were greeting an old friend instead of inspecting a machine. The afternoon breeze drifted through the open garage door carrying the scent of warm asphalt, fresh-cut grass, and motor oil. Somewhere across the street, a church bell rang 3 quiet notes. Behind the service counter, a small girl with blonde hair looked up from her homework and smiled the moment she saw Ethan. "Daddy," Lily Brooks called softly, "don't forget your sandwich this time." Ethan looked back and smiled with gentle embarrassment. "Thanks, sweetheart." Claire noticed the exchange. The little girl couldn't have been older than 9. She carefully folded the brown paper lunch bag before setting it beside an old family photograph taped near the cash register. There was no luxury here. No expensive furniture. No polished showroom. Only worn tools, steady hands, and a father who never seemed to lose his patience. Claire studied him with quiet curiosity. Most people became nervous around her money, her reputation, or her confidence. Ethan had done none of those things. He hadn't asked how much the reward would be. He hadn't tried to impress her. He hadn't even asked who she was. Instead, he opened the hood, listened to the silence beneath it for a long moment, and rested one hand on the engine as though it still had a story left to tell. Then, without looking up, he said in a voice so calm it almost disappeared beneath the hum of the summer air, "I'll fix your car, ma'am. But whether I become rich has nothing to do with what happens under this hood." Ethan reached for a simple socket wrench that looked older than some of the mechanics watching him. He loosened nothing at first. Instead, he listened. The garage settled into an unusual stillness as he leaned closer to the engine bay, closing his eyes for only a heartbeat before gently turning one pulley by hand. Claire watched with folded arms, expecting dramatic guesses or flashy explanations. She received neither. Ethan moved with quiet confidence, touching each component as though he respected every mile the car had ever traveled. The younger mechanics exchanged puzzled looks. One whispered that every specialist Claire had hired immediately connected expensive diagnostic computers. Ethan had not even plugged in a single machine. He simply listened, observed, and thought. Lily quietly walked behind the front counter and placed a glass of iced tea beside her father without interrupting him. He smiled without looking away from the engine. "Thank you, sweetheart." She returned to her homework, her pencil scratching softly across the paper while an old country song drifted from a dusty radio sitting on a shelf near the parts cabinet. Claire found herself watching the little girl almost as much as the repair itself. The warmth between father and daughter felt unfamiliar in a world where every minute of her own calendar had a price attached to it. Ethan finally spoke. "This engine is not broken because it is old." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Then why has every restoration expert failed?" Ethan carefully lifted a worn leather glove from the corner of the engine compartment. Beneath it rested a small handwritten service note that had yellowed with age. He did not read it aloud. He simply smiled to himself before continuing his inspection. Because everyone has been trying to replace history instead of understanding it. A few customers looked at one another in silence. Claire stepped closer for the first time, curiosity slowly replacing confidence. You can tell that just by looking? Ethan nodded gently. Machines speak. Most people are simply too busy to hear them. He reached deeper into the engine bay and carefully tightened a loose fitting that almost nobody would have noticed without removing half the assembly. Then he traced a fuel line with his fingertips before stopping at a connector hidden beneath years of careful restoration. Someone restored this beautifully, he said. But one small adjustment ignored the way the original engineers designed the fuel pressure. Claire blinked. That is exactly what the restoration report said. Ethan did not answer. He simply continued working, every movement patient, deliberate, and almost graceful. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the cracked parking lot, painting long golden shadows beneath the old oak tree beside the garage. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh hay from a nearby field, mixing with the familiar smell of gasoline and clean metal. The entire shop seemed to breathe more slowly. Claire realized something unexpected. She had arrived believing she was testing a struggling mechanic with an impossible challenge. Now she felt as though the challenge had quietly shifted toward her. For the first time in years, she was standing beside someone who seemed completely uninterested in her wealth, her title, or her approval. Ethan finally lowered the hood halfway, wiped his hands again, and looked toward the setting sun before speaking with the same steady voice that never seemed to change. The car is telling me exactly what it needs. The real question is whether the people who own it are ready to hear the rest of its story. Claire stepped closer until she could see every movement of Ethan's hands. There was nothing hurried about him. Every wrench returned to its place before another was picked up. Every bolt rested on a clean cloth in the exact order it had been removed. It looked less like mechanical work and more like someone carefully restoring a memory. One of the younger mechanics finally broke the silence. Sir, would you like me to bring over the diagnostic scanner? Ethan smiled politely without looking away from the engine. Not yet. Computers answer questions after people ask the right ones. The young man nodded, even though he clearly did not understand. Claire found herself studying Ethan instead of the Mustang. She had spent years building companies by measuring speed, efficiency, and results. Yet this quiet man seemed to trust patience more than urgency. It unsettled her in ways she could not explain. Lily walked outside carrying a small paper bag filled with homemade cookies. She offered one to Claire with the innocent confidence only a child could have. My father always forgets to eat when he is helping someone, she said with a warm smile. Maybe you should remind him later. Claire accepted the cookie almost automatically. Did he teach you to bake these? Lily giggled softly. No. He burns almost everything in the kitchen except pancakes. Ethan laughed quietly from beneath the open hood. That is probably true. A few people waiting in the customer area smiled for the first time that afternoon. The expensive suit, the worn garage, the little girl, and the weathered mechanic suddenly felt less like strangers standing in different worlds and more like ordinary people sharing the same peaceful moment. Claire tasted the cookie. It was simple, slightly uneven, and better than many desserts served at business banquets she had attended. She looked around the garage again. Family photographs lined a narrow shelf beside old trophies from local classic car shows. None of the awards were large. None of them looked expensive. Every frame carried years of fingerprints and quiet pride. Ethan carefully removed a small metal cover from the engine and paused. His eyes settled on a faded emblem stamped into one hidden component. He gently brushed away decades of dust before letting out a slow breath. Claire noticed the change immediately. Did you find something? She asked. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. I found someone. Claire frowned, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Ethan lifted the small component just enough for her to see an engraved signature nearly hidden beneath layers of age. Every master mechanic leaves fingerprints, he said softly. Some leave them with grease. Others leave them with ideas. Claire leaned closer. The signature stirred a distant memory she could not fully reach. She had seen it somewhere before, perhaps long ago in an old photograph or inside a forgotten company archive. Ethan carefully set the piece back into place with obvious respect. He did not explain further. Instead, he reached for another tool and continued working with the same quiet rhythm. Outside, the sun drifted lower across the western sky, filling the garage with warm amber light that reflected gently across the Mustang's polished fenders. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody interrupted the silence. Even the customers waiting for routine repairs remained seated, watching without impatience. Claire slowly realized that no one inside the garage seemed impressed by money. They were impressed by character. And as she watched Ethan continue his careful work without asking for recognition, praise, or reward, she began to wonder whether the greatest thing hidden beneath the hood of the old Mustang had never been the engine at all. Claire remained beside the Mustang long after she normally would have checked her watch and left for another meeting. Her assistant had already called twice, and both times she silenced the phone without answering. That alone surprised her. She never ignored her schedule. Yet something inside the quiet rhythm of the little garage made every deadline feel strangely unimportant. Ethan reached beneath the dashboard and carefully removed a small metal panel that had clearly not been touched in many years. Behind it rested a weathered envelope sealed inside a protective plastic sleeve. He stopped immediately. His hands did not tremble, but his expression softened in a way Claire had not seen before. He looked toward her. "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Did your father ever mention hiding personal notes inside the cars he loved most?" Claire stared at the envelope, then slowly shook her head. "No. He rarely talked about his work once he came home." Ethan carefully lifted the sleeve into the afternoon light. Dust floated through the golden sunbeams, crossing the garage floor while everyone watched without speaking. He handed the unopened envelope to Claire instead of opening it himself. "It belongs to you." Claire accepted it almost cautiously. The paper had yellowed with time, and her father's initials were written in the familiar handwriting she had not seen since she was a young woman. Her heartbeat slowed. She looked at Ethan. "You are not even curious?" He smiled gently. "Some stories are only meant to be opened by the people they were written for." The garage became so quiet that the ticking of the cooling exhaust could be heard again. Claire broke the brittle seal with careful fingers and unfolded a single handwritten page. Her eyes moved across the first few lines before she stopped reading aloud. Tears quietly gathered without warning. Lily looked toward her father with concern, but Ethan simply nodded, silently encouraging the little girl to give Claire the privacy she deserved. After several long moments, Claire folded the letter against her chest. "He wrote that this car was never his greatest achievement," she whispered. "He wrote that character always outlasts success, and that someday I would meet someone who understood that better than I did." She looked directly at Ethan. "I thought he was talking about another executive, another inventor, another leader." Ethan lowered his eyes with quiet humility. Maybe he was simply talking about the kind of person he hoped you would recognize when the time was right. Claire looked around the modest garage once more. The cracked concrete, the neatly organized tools, the family photographs, the laughter that had quietly replaced judgment, all of it suddenly carried a meaning she had completely overlooked when she first arrived. Wealth had built towers and boardrooms in her life, but it had never created the peace she felt standing inside this little shop. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the American flag hanging above the entrance, and the fading sunlight painted the old Mustang with a warm bronze glow. Ethan returned to the engine without asking another question, adjusting one final connection with steady hands before lowering the hood gently into place. He did not ask about the letter. He did not ask whether it had changed her. He simply respected the silence. Claire realized that the greatest lesson she had received that day had not come from a business school, a board meeting, or a billion-dollar company. It had come from a father who quietly believed that fixing what was broken always began with the heart before it ever reached the machine. Claire carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into its protective sleeve as though it were the most valuable thing she had ever carried. For years, she had measured success by quarterly reports, market shares, and headlines. Yet a single handwritten page from her father had quietly outweighed every award displayed in her office. Ethan noticed the change in her expression, but chose not to mention it. He believed people deserved the space to discover their own truths. Lily closed her school notebook and wandered toward the Mustang with a bright smile. She looked at Claire and asked, "Did your dad love old cars too?" Claire laughed softly, surprised by how natural the sound felt. "He loved this one more than almost anything." Lily gently rested her hand on the polished fender. "My dad says people leave a little piece of themselves inside everything they take care of." Claire looked at Ethan. Did you teach her that? Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. I probably learned it from her without realizing it. The answer drew another quiet laugh from everyone standing nearby. The atmosphere inside the garage no longer felt like a business challenge. It felt like neighbors sharing an evening after a long day. Outside, the sun continued its slow descent, casting warm light through the open garage door, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine trees from the hills beyond town. Ethan reached beneath the hood once more and adjusted a small fuel mixture screw by less than a quarter turn. He paused, listened, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Now it is ready. Claire watched every movement. You have not replaced expensive parts. You have barely changed anything. Ethan closed the hood with both hands and looked at her calmly. Sometimes the biggest problems begin with the smallest details. The same is true for engines. The same is true for people. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment. She knew he was no longer talking only about the Mustang. Ethan stepped into the driver's seat and turned the key halfway. The fuel pump hummed softly. He waited. No impatience. No unnecessary movement. After a few quiet seconds, he turned the key the rest of the way. The engine came to life with a smooth, confident rumble that filled the garage without strain or hesitation. Every conversation stopped. The steady sound echoed across the concrete floor like an old friend returning home after years away. One customer slowly removed his baseball cap. Another smiled and whispered, "That is exactly how those cars sounded when they were new." Ethan listened carefully for several moments before lightly pressing the accelerator. The engine answered with effortless precision. He switched it off and stepped out of the car as though completing an ordinary task instead of something that several respected restoration shops had failed to accomplish. Claire remained speechless. She had expected celebration, pride, perhaps even a demand for the promised reward. Ethan did none of those things. He simply handed her the keys with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning. She was never broken beyond repair, he said gently. She only needed someone willing to understand her before trying to change her. Claire accepted the keys with both hands. For the first time in many years, she realized that true expertise did not announce itself with confidence alone. It revealed itself through patience, humility, and the quiet dignity of someone who never needed applause to know the value of honest work. The gentle rumble of the restored engine faded into the evening air, leaving behind a silence that felt even more powerful than the sound itself. Claire stood motionless with the keys resting in her palm. She had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without hesitation, yet at that moment she struggled to find even a single sentence worthy of the man standing before her. Finally, she reached into her designer briefcase and removed a leather checkbook embossed with the Kensington Automotive logo. Without asking another question, she wrote an amount so large that every employee in the garage who happened to glimpse the number quietly held their breath. She tore out the check and offered it to Ethan with both hands. "You earned every dollar," she said sincerely. "Please accept it." Ethan looked at the check for only a brief moment before his eyes returned to Claire's. There was no excitement, no disbelief, and certainly no temptation. He smiled with the same quiet kindness that had never left his face throughout the afternoon. "Thank you," he said gently. "That is generous." Claire extended the check a little farther. "Then take it." Ethan slowly shook his head. "I cannot." Claire blinked in surprise. "Cannot or will not." Ethan folded the shop towel over his shoulder before answering. "Both." The mechanics exchanged confused glances. One customer quietly whispered that nobody refused an opportunity like this. Claire looked genuinely puzzled. "You told me you were raising your daughter alone. This money could change your lives." Ethan nodded. "It certainly could." He glanced toward Lily, who was placing her schoolbooks neatly inside a faded backpack near the counter. "But I promised her something a long time ago." Claire waited patiently. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. "I promised that she would grow up believing people should help others because it is the right thing to do, not because they expect the biggest reward." Lily looked up and smiled proudly, as though she had heard those words many times before. Claire lowered the check slightly. "Then what can I give you?" Ethan looked around the garage until his eyes settled on the old leather glove and the weathered service note that had been resting beside the engine earlier that afternoon. He reached into the toolbox and picked up a worn chrome wrench whose polished edges had been softened by decades of careful use. "This belonged to the mechanic who first worked on this car," he said quietly. "Someone replaced it with a newer one years ago and left it forgotten in the bottom drawer." Claire nodded slowly. "You want the wrench?" Ethan smiled. "If you are willing." Claire looked from the simple hand tool to the check worth more than many families would earn in a lifetime. The comparison almost made her laugh. "You are trading this for that." Ethan gently accepted the old wrench and turned it over in his hands with unmistakable respect. "No," he answered softly. "I am choosing the one thing that carries a story money cannot buy." The evening breeze drifted through the open garage once more, lifting the edges of the American flag outside, while the last rays of sunlight settled across the restored Mustang. Claire quietly folded the untouched check and slipped it back into her briefcase. For the first time in many years, she understood that wealth could purchase remarkable things, but it could never purchase integrity. And standing in that modest garage, watching a single father treasure an old wrench above a fortune, she realized she had just witnessed a kind of success that no balance sheet could ever measure. Claire drove away just as the last light slipped beneath the horizon, but the quiet garage remained in her thoughts long after the highway stretched beyond the town. The restored Mustang purred with a confidence it had not carried in decades, and every smooth shift through the gears reminded her of Ethan's steady hands and even steadier heart. She reached home later than usual, walked past the polished marble floors of her lakefront house, and carried the old letter directly into her study. Instead of opening her laptop, she unlocked a cedar cabinet that had not been touched in years. Inside rested dozens of boxes filled with her father's journals, engineering sketches, faded photographs, and company records collected throughout his career. She searched with no clear destination, guided only by a growing feeling that something important had been waiting for her all along. Nearly an hour passed before she discovered a worn leather notebook tucked beneath a stack of blueprints. She carefully opened it and recognized her father's unmistakable handwriting. One page contained a list of names beneath the words, "Engineers who cared more about doing the job right than receiving credit." Claire slowly read each name until she reached one that stopped her completely. Ethan Brooks. Her breathing caught. She looked again to make certain she had not imagined it. Beside his name her father had written, "Brilliant mechanical mind. Solves problems others overlook. Refuses shortcuts even when nobody is watching. If he ever disappears from this industry, the industry will lose far more than he will." Claire leaned back in stunned silence. She turned another page and found several technical sketches bearing two sets of handwritten notes, one from her father and another signed simply, Ethan. The ideas described improvements to fuel delivery systems and airflow efficiency years before similar concepts had become standard throughout the automotive world. Yet nowhere in the company's history had Ethan Brooks ever been recognized. She immediately called the oldest executive still working at Kensington Automotive. Harold Bennett answered after only a few rings. "Claire, everything all right?" She hesitated before asking, "Do you remember an engineer named Ethan Brooks?" The line became unexpectedly quiet. Harold finally sighed. "How could I forget? Your father respected him more than almost anyone. Ethan could solve impossible engineering problems with nothing but patience and common sense." Claire frowned. "Then why did he leave?" Harold answered softly. "He did not leave because he failed. He left because life asked more of him than his career ever could. After his wife became seriously ill, he walked away from promotions, recognition, and opportunities that people spend entire lifetimes chasing. He chose his family without complaining and never asked the company for anything in return." Claire closed her eyes as every conversation from the afternoon suddenly carried new meaning. Harold continued, "Your father tried more than once to bring him back, but Ethan always thanked him and said the most important title he would ever have was being Lily's father." Claire ended the call and looked across the quiet room toward the old letter resting beside her father's notebook. The man she had mistaken for an ordinary mechanic had quietly helped shape automotive innovations that had influenced her own company, yet he had never mentioned any of it. He had allowed his work, his character, and his love for his daughter to speak louder than his accomplishments ever could. For the second time that day, Claire realized she had not discovered a hidden talent. She had discovered a hidden legacy. The next morning arrived with a clear blue sky and the familiar smell of fresh coffee drifting through Ethan's small garage. Lily was sweeping the front sidewalk before school, while Ethan carefully organized his tools exactly where they belonged. To him, another ordinary day had begun. He had no idea that hundreds of miles away an entire executive board had spent the morning discussing his name. Claire stood at the head of the conference table holding her father's notebook. Every executive expected another presentation about profits or expansion. Instead, she quietly placed photocopies of several engineering sketches in front of them. "Does anyone recognize these designs?" she asked. Several senior engineers leaned forward. One of them adjusted his glasses before answering. These concepts were years ahead of their time. "We built entire product lines around improvements like these." Claire nodded slowly. The engineer who developed many of these ideas never received public recognition. She paused before speaking the name that left the room completely silent. "His name is Ethan Brooks." One executive frowned. "The mechanic from the small garage." Claire looked directly at him. "No. The engineer who quietly helped shape innovations this company still benefits from today." Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Claire closed her father's notebook. "This company has celebrated success for years. Today we begin honoring character." Less than an hour later, she was back behind the wheel of the restored Mustang, driving toward the little town with a purpose entirely different from the day before. When she arrived, she found Ethan helping an elderly customer understand why a simple repair would save money instead of replacing expensive parts. "You do not need a new system," Ethan explained kindly. "You only need one small seal. Let us fix what still has life left in it." The grateful customer smiled with relief and thanked him several times before leaving. Claire waited until the parking lot became quiet again. Ethan looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning. How is the Mustang running?" Claire returned the smile. "Perfectly." She took a slow breath. "I came to ask you something much more important than repairing a car." Ethan set his wrench on the workbench and gave her his full attention. "I would like you to become the chief engineering advisor for Kensington Automotive." The words echoed softly through the garage. Lily looked up from her backpack. The young mechanics froze where they stood. Claire continued before anyone could interrupt. "You would have complete freedom to mentor our engineers, restore forgotten projects, and help shape the future of the company. The salary would be whatever you believe is fair. The position is yours if you want it." Ethan remained quiet for several moments. He looked toward Lily, then around the modest garage that had carried his family's hopes through the hardest years of their lives. Finally, he spoke with the same calm voice Claire had come to respect. "It is an extraordinary offer." Claire waited hopefully. Ethan smiled with genuine gratitude before gently shaking his head. "But my daughter only gets one childhood. Every afternoon I spend here when she walks through that door after school is something I can never buy back. No position, no matter how important, is worth missing the moments that matter most." Claire lowered her eyes, not from disappointment, but from understanding. In that quiet garage, she finally realized that the richest man she had ever met measured his wealth in time, promises kept, and the smile of a little girl who never had to wonder whether her father would be there when she came home. 3 evenings later, just before the golden lights settled across the little town once again, a familiar engine rolled quietly into the parking lot of Ethan's garage. He looked up from replacing the brakes on a family sedan and immediately recognized the restored Mustang. Claire stepped out dressed far more simply than before, wearing blue jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes instead of a tailored business suit. There were no assistants, no security team, and no photographers. She carried only a small woven picnic basket in one hand and her father's notebook in the other. Lily ran outside with a bright smile. "You came back." Claire smiled just as warmly. "I said the car was running perfectly. I never said I was finished visiting." Ethan wiped his hands and walked toward them. "Everything all right?" Claire nodded. "Better than all right." She held out the notebook. "This belongs in your hands now. My father filled these pages with ideas, but many of them began with conversations he had with you. Keeping it locked away does not honor either of you." Ethan accepted the notebook carefully, turning a few pages before quietly closing it again. "Thank you." Claire looked around the peaceful garage one more time. The old workbench, the neatly arranged tools, the flower pots Lily had placed near the entrance, and the worn wooden sign above the office door suddenly felt more welcoming than any executive office she had ever entered. "I also brought dinner," she said with a gentle smile. Lily's eyes brightened immediately. "Is it pizza?" Claire laughed. I was hoping that would be a good guess. Ethan smiled. You did your research. The three of them carried folding chairs beneath the old oak tree beside the garage as the evening breeze stirred the leaves overhead. They shared slices of pizza, homemade lemonade prepared by Lily, and stories that had nothing to do with business. Claire spoke about fishing trips with her father when she was a little girl. Ethan shared funny memories of trying to learn how to braid Lily's hair after her mother passed away, admitting that the first attempts had been unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Lily laughed so hard that she nearly spilled her drink. The sound echoed gently across the quiet street, filling the evening with a simple joy that money could never arrange. As the sun slipped below the horizon, Claire looked toward Ethan. I finally understand why you turned down everything I offered. Ethan shook his head softly. I did not turn down opportunity. I simply chose the one I already had. Claire nodded with tears quietly gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from gratitude. I spent years believing success meant climbing higher than everyone else. You taught me it can also mean sitting beside the people who matter most. Ethan looked at Lily, who had fallen asleep with her head resting gently against his shoulder after a long day. He carefully placed his jacket over her to keep away the cool evening air. The world celebrates loud victories, he said softly, but the quiet ones are usually the ones that last. Claire smiled, understanding every word. She did not offer another contract, another fortune, or another title. Instead, she simply reached across the picnic table and thanked him for restoring far more than an old automobile. As the first stars appeared above the peaceful town, the Mustang rested quietly beside the little garage, its engine finally at peace, while three lives moved forward together with something far more valuable than wealth. They carried mutual respect, second chances, and the quiet certainty that true greatness is never measured by what a person owns, but by the kindness they leave behind in the hearts of others.